One busy afternoon in a narrow London back alley. Everything looks normal for a moment. Footsteps, a bike rolling past, the usual city noise, until you realize you're watching the last seconds before a life-changing collision. CCTV captures it all. Exauce Ngimbi circling on a bicycle, Kieron Brown pacing on foot, both sizing each other up. A few sharp words are traded, quick and final, and then it snaps. Weapons appear, the alley becomes a cage, and in a moment, only one man is left standing. This, however, was not an ordinary street scuffle. This was personal. Ngimbi and Brown were friends, mates, trusting each other with their lives. But then something happened. The trust was broken, and that culminated with one laying dead on the street. Let's take a look at exactly what happened, what led to this moment, and what happened after. Hackney turned into the backdrop for something brutal. The victim was 22-year-old Exauce Ngimbi, a young man from the area. And this wasn't a sudden random clash. It was the end of a feud that had been building for a long time, one that involved someone who once stood beside him, 26-year-old Kieron Brown. They weren't strangers who crossed paths by chance. They knew each other, ran with the same people, and at one point, they would have called each other friends. Both men had past connections to the Pembury Boys, a gang linked to the Pembury estate and known locally for drugs and violence. That environment shaped reputations, loyalties, and grudges, and Exauce and Brown came up around the same world. For a while they were on the same side, then something shifted. Their relationship started to rot from the inside, turning into a personal rivalry that everyone around them could feel. The exact reason was never completely clear to outsiders. Money, pride, a dispute, a power play. Whatever it was, it left a mark. And once it started, it didn't cool down. It kept getting worse. In the days before the killing, things escalated quickly. 10 days earlier, Brown was ambushed and beaten badly. Prosecutors later suggested Exauce or people close to him were responsible, and that attack became a turning point, something Brown couldn't let go of. After that, the streets filled in the blanks with rumors and theories, but one thing nobody doubted was this. Both men felt wronged, and neither wanted to be the one who backed down. Each incident fed the next one, pushing them closer to a final confrontation that was starting to feel unavoidable. The day before the killing, Exauce and Brown ran into each other again, and it almost kicked off right there. It was daytime, in public, on the estate. Witnesses say they were shouting, squaring up, and getting in each other's faces. People nearby had to step in and separate them while insults and threats flew back and forth. It didn't feel like normal arguing anymore. It felt like the last warning sign, because the anger between them had clearly reached the point where one more encounter could turn deadly. Anyone who knew what had been building between them could see it. This was spiraling, and nobody was pulling the brakes. And the big question hung in the air. Who was pushing it there? Was one of them chasing violence while the other was reacting, or were they both trapped in the same cycle of payback? All of that tension finally collided on December 5th, and unlike most street stories, this one had a cold, silent witness: CCTV. The cameras captured the key moments of that afternoon, step by step, letting investigators, and later a jury, rebuild the final meeting almost down to the second. Just before 2 p.m., Exauce Ngimbi and Kieron Brown ended up in the same place at the same time. At 1:57 p.m., Brown walked out from the Pembury estate and headed into Clarence Mews, a narrow back alley behind the busier Clapton streets. On the camera, he looks calm at first glance, but there's a stiffness to him, like he's carrying pressure. Around the same time, Exauce, known as Exo to friends, came in on a bicycle. They spotted each other and stopped. The CCTV has no sound, but you can see the exchange, faces turned, bodies angled, words going back and forth. A witness later described it as intense. Two men who used to be close, now looked in open hostility. Then Brown breaks away and steps into a small corner shop at the edge of the Mews. It's hard to know why. Maybe he wanted to cool it down for a moment. Maybe he was checking something. Outside, Exauce doesn't leave. He stays close, moving on the bike, keeping Brown in view. A moment later, Brown comes back out and heads down Clarence Mews again, this time with more purpose. The alley is tight and tucked away from the main road, the kind of place where a confrontation can happen fast and nobody nearby can stop it. And at 2 p.m. and 19 seconds, the CCTV catches a detail that later mattered a lot. Brown reaches into his coat and appears to check something hidden inside. It's quick and controlled, not accidental. In court, the jury was asked to think about what that movement meant. Was he touching a weapon? Making sure a knife was in place? Getting ready for what he believed was coming? Whatever the answer, the moment looks like preparation, like someone bracing for a fight rather than walking away from one. Exauce, still on his bicycle, follows Brown into the alley, maintaining a wary distance of a few paces. His eyes never leave Brown. Both men are now isolated in this cramped passageway, tension crackling in the air. Brown, aware that Exauce is right behind him, abruptly halts and spins around. His coat flings open, and in that instant, a blade flashes in the daylight. Brown has drawn a knife. It glints in his hand, a deadly piece of steel now out in the open. This is the point of no return. Exauce does not back off. He does not run. Instead, he steps off his bike, letting it clatter to the ground. In his hand suddenly is an even more terrifying weapon, a massive 46-centimeter sword. It's like a scene from an action movie now. Two rivals armed to the teeth in a modern duel, squaring off in a London back alley. These aren't just small pocket knives or makeshift blades. These are lethal weapons meant to maim and kill. How did it come to this? Only days ago, these two might have walked the same streets as friends, but now each is prepared to end the other's life. For a moment, they stand facing each other, knives out, hearts pounding. A lone CCTV camera peers down at them, recording it all dispassionately. There's no audio, but you can imagine the shouts and possibly the crude taunts they might be exchanging. Perhaps Brown is saying, "Come on then," and Exauce snarling back, "You want some of this?" Both men have chosen this confrontation. Neither is backing down. Each likely sees the other as an existential threat at this point. In the world of gangs, showing fear or backing down could mean vulnerability later, so the only option in their minds is to fight. They lunge and clash. 2 p.m. and 30 seconds, 40 seconds. The CCTV captures the chaotic struggle that ensues. Brown slashes with his knife. Exauce swings the long sword. The two figures dart and weave in the narrow lane, each trying to land a devastating blow. It's fast, frenetic, and deadly. A witness to the fight described it as going at it to try and stab each other. This is not a scuffle or a bit of posturing, it's an all-out knife fight. One friend who saw it later said, "It was not a first fight, it was a knife fight," emphasizing how lethal and serious this confrontation was. A couple of Exauce's associates are present at the mouth of the alley or just around the corner. They watch from a distance, shouting in alarm. Their presence later became a point of controversy. Were they simply bystanders frozen in shock? Or were they, as Brown's defense claimed, part of an ambush, deliberately blocking Brown's possible escape route? On the footage, you can see at least one or two fingers hovering, but they don't directly intervene in the duel between Exauce and Brown. Perhaps they were torn between the instinct to help their friend and the instinct of self-preservation, or the street code that in a one-on-one fight, you don't interfere unless it's absolutely necessary. Whatever their intentions, at this moment, it's essentially Exauce and Brown alone in combat. Blades clash and flash. Each man is desperately trying to overcome the other. Initially, neither seems to gain the upper hand. The fight presses on for what feels like an eternity, but in reality is only seconds. They grapple, and each manages to dodge fatal strikes. Both are likely already cut or grazed, but adrenaline is surging, and neither stops. Then, in the scuffle, it appears Exauce's larger sword may have been dropped or knocked from his grasp. We later know that sword was found on the ground. Perhaps Brown managed to smack it away, or Exauce lost grip in the fury of swinging it. At one point, Brown manages to wrestle Exauce, and both men break apart, separating for a brief moment to catch their breath. At this juncture, Brown begins to back away down the alley. It's now around 2:01 p.m. There's a momentary lull. On camera, we see Brown walking backward, knife still in hand, and Exauce a short distance away near his fallen bike. For a fleeting moment, it looks like the confrontation might end there. Brown appears to be disengaging, perhaps deciding it's too risky to continue. Exauce is still standing, apparently not seriously hurt yet, and Brown has an opening to leave. If it had ended here, both men might have walked away injured, but alive. But this feud had momentum of its own. It wasn't over. As Brown turns and takes a few steps away, Exauce makes a fateful decision. He gets back on his bicycle and starts to follow Brown again. Maybe Exauce refused to let his rival just walk away unharmed. Maybe he was emboldened, thinking Brown was retreating, and he wanted to chase him off for good. Or perhaps Exauce saw an opening to strike Brown from behind. It's impossible to know his thought process, but the effect is clear. The fight resumes. Exauce pedals towards Brown, closing the gap once more. Brown, hearing the bicycle coming up behind him, whirls around to face his opponent again. The fight reignites in an instant. This time, the final moments come swiftly and brutally. Exauce either jumps off his bike or collides with Brown, and the two clash head-on. In the flurry that follows, the decisive blow is struck. Exauce Ngimbi falls to the ground. The CCTV shows his figure suddenly collapsing onto the pavement. This is the turning point, the fatal moment that seals both of their fates. Exauce is down, perhaps wounded from a well-placed stab. Brown doesn't hesitate for even a split second. He seizes the opportunity now that his rival is on the ground and vulnerable. Brown steps toward the fallen Exauce and with a fury unleashed, begins thrusting his knife into him again and again. Once, twice, 3 times in total. Brown plunges his blade into Exauce 8 times in just a matter of seconds. The ferocity is almost unimaginable. It is a rapid, violent barrage aimed to end the conflict once and for all. Later, prosecutors would say these final stabs were delivered with such force and intensity that there was no question about Brown's intent in that moment. And then, as suddenly as it began, it is over. Exauce Ngimbi lies bleeding and motionless on the ground of that alley. Brown steps back, the bloody knife still in his hand, his chest heaving from the exertion and adrenaline. One of Exauce's friends finally rushes forward, screaming in horror. Brown glances around. He knows he must flee now if he wants to avoid immediate arrest or retaliation. The CCTV catches the last image of Brown at 2:01 and some seconds. He turns and runs out of the alley, back the way he came, his knife still clearly visible in his hand as he disappears from the camera's view. He leaves behind a scene of devastation and chaos. In those final moments of the fight, one friend did try to intervene. A close friend of both men, who had been watching in disbelief, later recounted how he screamed at them to stop. He couldn't get between them while 2 blades were swinging. It was too dangerous. But when Exauce fell, his friend saw the knife strikes continue, and he couldn't stand by any longer. He lunged toward Brown, trying to grab Brown's wrist to stop the stabbing. In doing so, he briefly grappled with Brown, attempting to wrest the knife away. Brown yanked the blade free violently, cutting through the friend's hand and slicing the tendons in the friend's fingers. The friend recoiled in pain, and Brown took that moment to bolt. This brave attempt to save Exauce came at a cost. The friend was injured, and yet he couldn't stop the killing from happening. Later on, this same witness would say, "I was screaming at them, trying to stop them. I panicked and lunged for his wrist, but he pulled the blade from me and sliced my fingers." It was a moment of desperate heroism amid the carnage. As Brown fled, Exauce's other associates and friends who had been nearby also scattered, vanishing into the warren of the estate's walkways. In the aftermath, not a single one of them cooperated with the police or agreed to give evidence in court. This silence speaks volumes about the code of the streets, a powerful silent statement about loyalty and fear. In that world, even when your friend is dying, talking to the authorities is seen as betrayal or invites deadly retaliation. So they disappeared, leaving Exauce bleeding on the ground, and later they would tell the police nothing. It's a heartbreaking reality. Their friend lay dying, but their fear or allegiance to street rules kept them from seeking immediate help or later testifying to bring the killer fully to justice. Within minutes, bystanders or perhaps residents who had heard the commotion called emergency services. Paramedics and police officers arrived swiftly at the scene at Clarence Mews. They found Exauce Ngimbi collapsed in a pool of blood on the pavement. The medics fought to stabilize him right there in the alley. It was a grisly scene. 8 stab wounds covered Exauce's upper body, and he was losing blood rapidly. Despite their urgent efforts, CPR, pressure on wounds, everything, it soon became clear that his injuries were catastrophic. At approximately 2:30 p.m., less than half an hour after the attack, Exauce Ngimbi was pronounced dead at the scene. A young life, just 22 years old and about to become a father, was gone. In the days that followed, a post-mortem examination would reveal the full horror of what had been done to Exauce. He had 8 separate sharp force wounds, all inflicted by Brown's knife. 3 of those wounds were deemed instantly fatal on their own. They had severed vital arteries and even pierced his heart. One stab to the chest had gone so deep and forcefully that it broke through bone and cartilage to reach the heart. The pathologist noted that such sheer force was required to inflict some of these injuries that it left no doubt this was a determined and vicious attack, not some lucky or fluke strike. These were deliberate kill shots. This evidence would later be crucial in court, demonstrating a clear intention to kill or at least cause grievous harm. Exauce's death was brutal and decisive, not the result of a random scuffle or an accident in the heat of the moment, but a focused and violent assault by someone who meant to do maximum damage. For a community already scarred by violence, this killing was another devastating blow. Exauce Ngimbi's family and friends were left to mourn a young man who, by several accounts, had a good heart despite the rough environment he grew up in. Heartbreakingly, it came out that Exauce's girlfriend was pregnant at the time. He'd been excited to become a father for the first time, talking about how he was looking forward to raising his child. That child, a daughter, would be born the following year, never having met her dad. As one friend later lamented, his daughter was born last September, and she will never get to know what a great guy he was. The ripple effects of this violent feud would extend far beyond just the 2 men who fought. A baby would grow up without a father, a family without their son, and a community with 2 fewer young men. Meanwhile, after fleeing the scene, Kieron Brown went on the run, but not for long. Within hours of the stabbing, police had identified him as the prime suspect. They likely had plenty of intelligence from his prior gang involvement and from witnesses pointing to him, even if those on Exauce's side wouldn't talk. CCTV and perhaps other community tips gave Brown's name. A manhunt ensued. Later that same day, or possibly very early the next morning, officers located and arrested Kieron Brown. Realizing the gravity of what had happened, Brown did not attempt some dramatic standoff or further violence. He was taken into custody without incident. In fact, Brown claimed at the moment of arrest that he was planning to turn himself in peacefully. Whether or not that's true, by the time he was in handcuffs, his mind was already working on a story to tell. When interrogated by the police, Brown immediately lawyered up and presented a prepared statement rather than answering questions freely. This statement was a detailed account of the incident, one clearly crafted to paint Brown in the best possible light and justify his actions. It was, as the prosecution later described, a very self-serving story. In it, Kieron Brown claimed that he was the real victim in this deadly fight. According to Brown's version, he had been ambushed and surrounded by a group of armed attackers, implying Exauce's friends, and he was simply fighting for his life. He said that Exauce came at him with that 46cm sword, and that he somehow managed to disarm Exauce during the struggle. Brown insisted that any stabbing he did was done in a state of pure panic and self-preservation, only because he believed it was kill or be killed at that moment. In short, Brown was claiming self-defense, that he never intended to kill anyone, but was forced into a life-threatening situation by Exauce and his gang and reacted instinctively to save himself. This account, if true, might legally exonerate Brown or at least reduce his culpability, but from the outset, investigators were skeptical. There were immediate contradictions and inconsistencies in Brown's story when compared to what the evidence was already showing. For one, Brown's claim that he was surrounded by a group of armed men doesn't clearly match the CCTV footage. The video showed 2 men fighting one-on-one, not Brown being attacked by multiple people at once. Yes, Exauce's associates were nearby, but they were not all piling onto Brown. Brown's assertion that he had disarmed Exauce, taking away the sword, had some truth. The sword was indeed found dropped at the scene, and forensic analysis would even find Brown's DNA on the sword's blade, suggesting he had grabbed it at some point. This piece actually supported part of his statement. It indicated that during the fight, Brown did come into contact with the sword, consistent with him possibly wrestling it away from Exauce. However, other elements of Brown's narrative started to crumble under scrutiny. Detectives pored over the meticulous CCTV timeline and gathered forensic evidence from the scene. The CCTV was the bedrock of the case, almost like having a silent eyewitness that couldn't be intimidated or influenced. It showed Brown's movements before the fight, including that telling moment where he reached into his coat, which looked like he was preparing rather than being caught off guard by an ambush. It showed that Brown was the one who stopped and turned to confront Exauce rather than trying to flee from a group. Crucially, the video captured the horrifying final sequence, Brown delivering that flurry of stabs after Exauce had already fallen to the ground. This part of the footage was perhaps the most damning because if Exauce was down and possibly incapacitated, continuing to stab him repeatedly looks less like self-defense and more like revenge or an intent to finish the job. Besides the video, forensic officers recovered that 46cm sword at the scene, stained with Exauce's blood. The presence of Brown's DNA on the sword's blade was an interesting twist. Brown, of course, pointed to it as proof that he had been fighting for his life, claiming it showed he grabbed the blade out of panic. Indeed, he likely cut himself or at least touched the blade. But prosecutors would later interpret it differently. Perhaps Brown grabbed the sword after Exauce was down, maybe to move it away or even use it, but ultimately he did not need to use the sword since he had his knife. Either way, all the evidence had to be fit into one of the two competing narratives. Was Brown a man defending himself from a sword-wielding rival and his posse, or was he an aggressor who came armed and ready to exact vengeance on a former friend? With Exauce dead and no cooperative eyewitness from his side, the case would largely hinge on the physical evidence and Brown's own words. It moved to Harrow Crown Court, where Kieron Brown was formally charged with murder and with possession of a bladed article, the knife. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense. On one side, Exauce's grieving family seeking justice for what they saw as a cold-blooded killing, and on the other, Brown's defense team arguing that this was a tragic but justifiable act of self-defense. The jury had the unenviable task of passing all the evidence and deciding Brown's fate. The central question, was this murder, or was it self-defense? Brown's stance stayed the same. He said he genuinely believed he would be killed if he didn't act. According to him, Exauce confronted him with a sword, with one or two associates nearby, leaving him trapped and terrified. The defense pointed to an alleged beating Brown suffered about 10 days earlier and argued that he carried a knife for protection, not to go looking for trouble. When the sword came out, they said, Brown panicked and fought back with what he had. The prosecution told the jury to look closer. This wasn't a helpless man caught in a sudden ambush, they argued. It looked like a showdown between rivals. Brown had options: keep walking, run, disengage. Instead, he stopped, revealed the knife, and stood his ground. Prosecutors called it a voluntary, gang-linked grudge match meant to show Brown was willing to engage. Then they focused on the moment they said destroyed self-defense. Even if Brown feared the sword at the start, they argued, self-defense has limits. Once Exauce was on the ground, the threat had changed. The rapid series of 8 stab wounds was presented as rage and revenge, not survival. One prosecutor spelled it out. This was murder, an unlawful killing with intent to kill, or at least to cause really serious harm. Legally, the jury had to decide whether Brown's force was reasonable for what he honestly believed was happening. Did he truly have no safe way out? Did he choose to re-engage? And if the fight began as defense, did it become excessive once Exauce was down? Brown did not give live evidence beyond the prepared statement and did not enter the witness box for cross-examination. The prosecution highlighted that, arguing his story wouldn't stand up, especially where parts of it seemed to clash with what the footage showed. After deliberation, the jury delivered a split decision. Brown was found not guilty of murder, but they also rejected complete self-defense. They convicted him of manslaughter and of possessing the bladed article during the incident, holding him responsible for the unlawful killing while stopping short of the intent required for murder. At sentencing, Her Honor Judge Rosa Dean described Brown as dangerous and imposed an extended determinate sentence of 18 years, 15 years in custody plus 3 years on extended license, with a concurrent term for the knife offense. Brown appealed, but in November 2021, the Court of Appeal refused the appeal, leaving the conviction and sentence in place. And that's what a feud leaves behind. A life lost, another life defined by prison, and families carrying the fallout. I lost 2 friends that day, one friend said. One is in prison, the other died in front of me. If you want more case breakdowns like this, hit subscribe and join the community.